War on Want has taken a position that we're not campaigning for either an in or an out vote. We're basically trying to use the opportunity of the EU referendum to educate people on what the EU is actually about, because in our view 99% of the people in Britain really haven't got any direct experience of the EU. Personally, myself, I have had the experience over the last 20 years of trying to change European Union policy, so I know directly how difficult it is to get any purchase on the EU institutions. So from my personal perspective, I can't see that there's any point in voting in, because we can never change Europe for the better. Voting in is just a vote for the status quo, and the status quo is not good. Well, the three main bodies of the European Union are the EU Council of Ministers, that's the heads of government of the 28 member states. They meet together and they basically form the supreme governance body. They're the ones who have the sort of supreme decision-making power. Then you've got the European Commission, and the European Commission is effectively the civil service for the European Union, but it's more than a normal civil service. It's a very powerful institution. It has this thing called the right of initiative, which means it can launch legislation, it can decide what Europe is actually going to do. And also, of course, it's not transparent, it's not accountable, and it's not elected, despite the fact that it has all this power. And then the third body is the European Parliament. The European Parliament is the elected body. It's the MEPs that we return every 5 years to Brussels, to Strasbourg. But the problem is, of course, that they have very little power. The most democratic bits of the European Union are the most powerless bits, and that's part of the problem. We know that voting to come out of the European Union doesn't solve all of our problems by any means. We know that the government in Britain is the most right-wing of any of the European Union member states, and therefore we're just going to come out of the frying pan into the fire. The difference is that at least in Britain there is at least some democratic channel through which we can challenge our government, and that's the problem about the European Union. There is a massive democratic deficit, and this is particularly worrying now since the Treaty of Lisbon came in 2009. There's been an explicit understanding that the member states have to take second place to the European Union, and that's why last year in Greece, for example, when the Greek people said we want an alternative, we don't want to have to put up with the austerity program imposed from the centre of the European Union, they were told explicitly by Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, there can be no choice against the European treaties. And the European treaties, particularly the Lisbon Treaty, says that you, as ordinary members of your own national bodies, cannot question the line that's been taken at the centre. The only thing that it allows for individual countries to do is to withdraw from the European Union. And that's the problem. There is this democratic problem right at the heart of Europe, which can only be solved according to the official rules by leaving. So at the moment, all of the trade and investment policies of the European Union go through Brussels. That's one of the things which came in through the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009. We don't have a national trade or investment policy. So if we come out of the EU, then we will regain control over our own trade and investment policies. Yes, obviously, that when we're members of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, we will be bound by the rules that the WTO puts down. And unfortunately, a lot of those rules are simply in favor of big business and against the interests of ordinary people. But we, at least as the UK, will be able to have a decision as to whether or not we abide by those rules and what position we take vis-à-vis the broader trading blocs and the bilateral groups. If you're in the European Union, we don't have any control over that. That goes through Brussels. It's quite clear that if you want to tackle global problems, you've got to do it together with other nations. That's completely obvious. But the idea of being in the European Union is not just some sort of fuzzy idea of doing things with others. It's a particular set of institutions which are following a particular set of rules and policies which at the moment are directed solely towards the interests of big business, transnational capital, and against the interests of the environment, people, society. And I think that if people feel that somehow just being part of a big club is the answer, they're not really paying attention to the problem. The European Union has adopted policies which are completely counter to the fight against climate change. So the key thing in the European Union is not that it's just the sum of its parts. You could think that perhaps if you had a whole lot of progressive governments, then they could change the direction of the EU. But actually the point about the treaties of the European Union is that it locks us into a predetermined path. And that path is a path which has been developed by capital for capital. It's not in favour of people or the planet. It's specifically for big business. And so there is no democratic choice that can shift the European Union from its current path.